Wiggle, 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 wiggle.
I don't know what the hell's happened to Friedman. He keeps on sloping off. So once again, Mr. Barry Tadcaster.
He got sloping off with loose women and drinking and taking drugs and stuff like that. Our next speaker is Kevin Goodman. Kevin is an aromatherapist from Chesterfield. Does that know, Sally? Does that? He's an aromatherapist from Chesterfield, and he lists his favourite odours as the scent of Nicholas Witchell and the aroma of a witch's belt. His talk tonight is called Balms and Liniments I Have Known. Kevin Goodman, aromatherapist.
It's actually a lie, it's Nicholas Parsons, not Nicholas Witchell. Right, good evening everyone, it's wonderful to be here. I'm going to be talking to you tonight about the Warminster phenomenon. I don't know how many of you out there, I can see, not many, have actually heard of Warminster. Could anybody put their hands up if they have, please? Oh good, I'm preaching converted. Right. Warminster is a very small town on the edge of Salisbury Plain in Wiltshire. Until the 1960s, in the mid-1960s, basically it was only really known for two things. Longleat and the School of Infantry that was based there. Now, Warminster had a population in those days of about 11,000 people, and they were mainly stolid Wiltshire farming folk. Now, Warminster has, over the years, had a great deal of bad press. A lot of serious UFO researchers like to dismiss the phenomenon as nothing more than media hype. I'm going to tell you a few stories tonight that will hopefully, if you believe that, may possibly change your mind. I can't promise it, but I'll try. Now, the main organ, as it were, for breaking the Warminster phenomenon was the Warminster Journal. Now, on Christmas Day of 1964, a woman was walking to church where she was assailed, according to the local journalist Arthur Shuttlewood, by sonic sounds, which left her weak-kneed and frightened. Now, you probably won't be able to see this on the screen. That is actually the press report from that time. And the bottom bit reads, "This shy lady would be glad to hear from anyone else who heard the noise that could give some explanation. Her knees were knocking all the way to the church." Well, the local journalist Arthur Shuttlewood knew a good story when he saw it. And very soon, more noises were reported. Pigeons had been reported to have been killed in mid-flight, and instant rigor mortis set in. For about 6 months, these sounds were heard throughout the area. People would say that it reminded them of tree branches being dragged across roofs, shingle being dropped outside, but there was no visible sign of what caused it. Now, everything broke around May, June time of 1965, when the first visible signs of what was known as the Thing, because the people in the locality didn't really know that much about flying saucers, UFOs, call them what you will, and they just referred to this phenomenon as Thing. Very soon, strange lights were seen in the sky, things such as were described as twin red-hot pokers, fast-moving lights were being reported into the journal. And Arthur Shuttlewood, the local journalist, as I said earlier on, started to amass stories and began to collate files. Now, Arthur was not a native of Warminster. He was actually born in Chelmsford, Essex, in 1920. He moved to the area after being evacuated from Dunkirk, where he started training on tanks. But unfortunately, and this only came to light recently, Arthur had an accident. Sadly, a tank lid hatch dropped on his head and detached one of his retinas. So he was invalided out of the army. By this time he'd started dating a young lady from the area, Philippa Curtis, and after a whirlwind romance they were married, and Arthur then settled down into Warminster. Arthur was, he liked to think, a subjective reporter, and although he was amassing all these reports, he'd never seen the thing for himself yet, and he was sceptical. However, you're now about to hear Arthur Shuttlewood, in his own words, actually describing the day when his stance on the phenomenon changed. Fingers crossed the technology worked. No, he didn't.
Well, I thought this will always be indelible on my mind because it was 3:42 p.m. on the last Tuesday, that's September the 28th, last Tuesday in September. I went upstairs, but my attention was arrested by this huge cigar shape in the sky. Now, had I normally been walking underneath that, I'm sure it would have assumed the proportions of nothing but a dense white cloud. But from the angle of vision that I had from the top of our house, I could see a peculiar hump, a yellow or amber burnished protrusion from the top. And I've never seen anything like this in all my life. And it was 9 months after this thing started. And I honestly don't think I've been conditioned to all that extent. Although I've lived in the centre or the vortex of this mystery, let's face it, it is a mystery. But I wasn't convinced, even in spite of the high calibre of witnesses, I wasn't convinced that this thing existed. But I saw this with my own eyes. I dashed straight away to the camera. I got the camera lined up, and the setting was about 8. It's a beautiful, clear afternoon. Out of the window, this thing came along over Colloway Clump, which is over there, northwest to southeast, gliding along a gentle giant in the sky. I trained my camera on it, and I felt the camera jumping about in my hands. So that was the first unusual aspect. It didn't frighten me, but I felt like sharp, prickling needles down that side of the hand, the wrist, that side of the face, and my eye watered for 2 months afterwards on that side. That was the exposed side to this thing.
Now, by this time, the local population were getting a little jumpy about what was going on in the town, so a meeting was arranged in the town hall for the August Bank Holiday weekend of 1965. But just prior to that, the Warminster phenomenon actually hit the press in a very big way. This photograph, which is now the iconic image of the Warminster phenomenon, was taken by a young factory worker by the name of Gordon Faulkner. And he said that he noticed it when he was going out to his sister's to take the camera that he was carrying, that she wanted to borrow it, which I think is quite fortuitous. The object was apparently speeding at quite a rate of knots across the sky. He just lined the camera up and took the photograph, and that is the result. Now, this photograph was then sent to the Daily Mirror, which then printed it as a centre page spread. But if anyone knows anything about old-fashioned photography, you can see that this has been blown up to such an extent that the grain of each individual silver halide is actually visible. And I recently tried to do a digital recreation of actually how the photograph would have looked originally, and this is how it would have looked. Okay. Now, there is a lot of debate whether or not the Faulkner photograph is genuine. I've had a number of very interesting email conversations with a gentleman by the name of Roger Hooton over the years, who says that it was all one big stunt. And the actual thing, the UFO, call it what you want to, is actually made out of a cotton reel, some foil and a button. But Faulkner stays true to his story. So again, unfortunately, with this particular part of the phenomenon, it stays as it is for today. Now, again, the press loved the story. It must have been a very, very slow August, September in 1965 for press stories. Arthur Shuttlewood then began to collate his reports, and the result was his first book, which was called, obviously, The Warminster Mystery, published by Neville Spearman in 1967. There's an interesting story about this that in another Neville Spearman book written by Binchley and Poet Trench called The Sky People, on the back flyleaf there is actually an advert for the Warminster sighting. So somebody at Neville Spearman must have thought they wanted something a little bit more racy and pacey, and hence the Warminster mystery was born. Very soon, people descended upon the town to see the thing for themselves. This is Cradle Hill. It's probably the most famous skywatching location in the world. It's about a mile or so outside the town, and I believe that it was probably chosen simply for its ease of access. On one occasion, they say that there were 1,500 people up there on the hill one night, just looking and waiting for a sign of the thing. Arthur Shuttlewood spent many, many nights up on the hill over the next 10, 15 years, almost to the detriment of his own health, unfortunately. Now, these purport to show some photographs that were taken in Warminster by one of Arthur Shuttlewood's team, a man by the name of Bob Strong. The top one is an army flare. I'm sorry, I've actually done this sort of photography myself. The bottom photograph is what is known as a negative kink. I don't know if anybody's ever done their own photography, their own developing, but if you actually catch the negative as you load it into the carousel to develop it, and you pinch it, that white crescent is the result. Again, Bob Strong was a very, very colourful character. And unfortunately, Arthur Shuttlewood, I think, was taken in to a degree over some of the stories that Bob actually told him. Now, in 1967, the left picture there, those are UFO landing nests, according to Shuttlewood. I think today we probably call them crop circles, but as you can see, there's not a lot of circle actually on them. The right picture there is a map of Cradle Hill, and just get this to work. There we go. The main skywatching point was here, by an area called the White Gates, which are sadly no longer there. The copse there, which has the barn in it, comes into the story a little bit later on, and basically, following the road down, you then go into Warminster town itself. Cop Heap is an ancient burial mound, apparently, where it is said that the devil takes the guise of a dog on Easter Sunday and roams around the town. Let's move that on slightly, hopefully. Right. Sightings continued in Warminster, possibly through the diligent reporting and, shall we say, media manipulation of Arthur Shuttlewood into the 1970s. And here you see the cover of a magazine, obviously called, rather magically entitled, the Warminster UFO Newsletter. It was published by a gentleman who moved to town by the name of Ken Rogers. Now, Ken Rogers was a Fleet Street journalist who had got the Warminster bug in a big way, and he lived in the town on and off for the next 15 to 20 years before his sad demise. In 1993, just after he died, this book, The Warminster Triangle, was published. It's not only about UFO sightings in the area, but it is also regarding crop circles, Neolithic sites, and the like. Now we come to the piece where this really is more up to date, and it's where I come into the story. Ken Rogers left the town around 1975, leaving a vacuum of researchers. And this building, in the middle here, Star House, was purchased by a gentleman by the name of Peter Paget. He was there. And his then wife, stroke partner, Jane Paget. The idea was that it would become a research centre and a self-sustaining community. Everybody would be unpaid. Basically, they would get board and lodgings. The whole ethos of the Fountain Centre was to research and report into the Warminster phenomenon. And with Archie Shuttlewood's patronage, the Fountain Journal first saw light in 1976, in June of 1976. Now, Peter Paget has been notoriously publicity shy for very many years. And for UFO Matrix magazine, of which I am a sometime contributor, I actually tracked him down and I did an interview with him. And as I say, he's very publicity shy, but he did agree to actually allow me to use this small soundbite.
In the mid-1970s, I became very interested in the activity of Warminster and all that it might imply. With the cooperation of various family members, I was able to purchase an old house built in 1864, which became known as Star House, and housed the Fountain Centre. This became a focal point and medium and conduit for people to meet, discuss, research, and examine the many and strange events that were happening at that time. Arthur Shuttlewood was also cooperative with the project, but made no actual financial contribution. He was not a rich man. We neither had vast funds, and basically run the whole operation on a shoestring. Those who were there at the time remember these young and exciting times. After a period of time, unfortunately, various family members could no longer support the project, which was non-profit making and not in keeping with what they perceived it might be. Unfortunately, this meant the assets had to be sold, and I moved on, basically, to write the Wiltshire.
It's very interesting that not only was the reason that family matters came into the closure of the Fountain Centre, but it was also the fact that there was a hell of a lot of UFO group politics in Warminster at the time. It's very sad, and it is still going on today, unfortunately. Now, I stayed at the Fountain Centre. I was an active member of it. I first went to Warminster in 1976. Now, I'd been interested in the UFO subject for many years as a young child. And I'll always remember my father coming home from work, bringing home with him a copy of Erich von Däniken's Chariots of the Gods. Now, bearing that my parents were both staunch Roman Catholics, it was slightly unusual for Dad to do this. And basically, I turned my back on what was, I consider at the time, conventional religion, because I basically believed God was an astronaut. Now, in this time, which would have been about 1973, 1974, Tandem Books began a major reprint of what we now call classic UFO books. Brinton LePoe Trench's books, Arthur Shuttlewood's, Brad Steiger, most of the books that had been published in the 1960s, which in those days, in hardback, were actually out of the range of most people's pockets, were being released as paperbacks. So I devoured them up. They were coming out about one a week. You know, I mean, that's where my pocket money went straight away, straight down to the local newsagents, baited for. One of those books was The Warminster Mystery. Now, up until this time, I'd only really thought of UFOs mainly as an American phenomenon, because those were the only books that I'd actually been subjected to. And there was this sticker on the front, or this hype on the front, saying dramatic UFO sightings in England. And I thought, wow, I'm getting this one. And I read it in one day, which, looking back on Arthur's writing now, was an absolute miracle, to be honest with you. So, I vowed to go to Warminster. And I finally got there in 1976. But, in October of 1976, I went back to Star House after my first visit in the summer. And I went with some friends. And this is where the story takes off, my own personal experiences. In those days, the height of technology was a cassette recorder. There's no two ways about it. Or a Polaroid camera, the old Instamatics. That's all we had, apart from pen and paper. So we would go up to Cradle Hill during the day, and we would make an audio diary. You know, we're walking up the track, we're going towards the copse. We'd come back and listen to it. And on the first recording was basically what you would class as the sound of a Geiger counter. Very faint, but in the background. So we thought, quite naturally, there's a fault with the tape recorder. So we got another tape recorder, fresh tape, even went out and bought some new batteries. Went up the hill for a second time, exactly the same thing happened again. So we were slightly puzzled with this. So we called Peter Paget in, and he listened to the tape, and he said, well, no, he said, I haven't heard anything like this before on tapes that have been made at Cradle Hill. He said, there are reports of the mysterious night walker, mysterious footsteps, slithering serpents of sound, but nothing like this. Well, this continued. Now, bearing in mind that this was the autumn of 1976, you know, it's the season of misty mellowness. And the last night we went up to the hill was an absolute corker. You couldn't see your hand in front of your face. So we're up there. And suddenly we get this impression that we are being watched. No, we're up there on our own, because nobody in their right mind would go up to the hill at that time of the year in that weather, not even after Shuttlewood. And we were at an area that was known as the White Gates, which I pointed out earlier on. This gate here now no longer exists, and you can actually now drive through that and park your car. That gate has been removed and has been placed by a very heavy-duty barrier to stop the denizens of Warminster from actually walking their dogs up there. And on the left-hand side here, a spinney has now been planted, but this is all in the future. We were at this area here by the gate, and we were getting very seriously spooked. My one friend and I walked away from our other friend who was actually sat on the bar at the top bar of the gate. And this impression, this feeling got stronger. As soon as we went back to Colin, this feeling diminished. Now, a day or so before this, at the top of the barn at Cradle Hill, sorry, at the top of the copse, there is this barn. And that is a grain drying tunnel. It is now capped, probably because too many people used to go down there and smoke illicit substances. However, we decided to go down there and do a test recording. So we went down, it went down about 3 or 4 feet, levelled out. We were like 2 overgrown moles. We crawled along, and we just then sat there in total silence while the cassette recorder carried on recording. We got back to the fountain centre, and this time, instead of the Geiger counter, we got heartbeats, or what appeared to be heartbeats. Now, what I'd like to point out is that probably some of you are thinking it's electrical interference. No. The nearest point of any power would be about a mile away at the golf club. There were no electric fences. There was nothing. I mean, that copse is in the middle of nowhere. Now, we were underground, surrounded by concrete. So, what interfered? I mean, somebody a while back said to me, oh, it could well be microwave radiation. Well, okay, fine. But if it was that strong to carry through that amount of concrete underground, I wouldn't be stood here now. Now, going back to that last night on the Thursday evening, we left that hill at a rapid rate of knots. I think they would probably call it in military terms a dignified retreat. And we got back to the fountain centre. Now there is a side door. The fountain centre, Star House, Carton Villa, is still there in the town. It's now occupied by, I think it's an outdoor adventure centre. This section here no longer exists. It's been knocked down and there's been an extension built. But the main body of the house is still there. We walked through the gate and around to the side door. Now, Star House had an open door policy at all times. When there were sky watchers staying, they could be up on the hills until 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, so that door was never locked. We got there, and the door was locked. The Pagets had gone out that night, and there were people staying in the top floor. Then it started to rain. Now, we were penniless students in those days, so our cassette recorders and Polaroid instamatic cameras were very precious to us. So Colin, my friend, said he would put his coat on over them and wait while we went round the back of the building to try and get somebody's attention to let us in. My other friend and I went round the back. Couldn't find anybody. We tried throwing, there was a light on, as I said, at the top of the house, so we tried throwing stones and yelling, and nobody answered. So we came back round the outside here, the back of what was the odd servants' quarters, and we found Colin flat out on the lawn. Now, in those days, I was quite slim, believe it or not, I was. And we decided the only way to get in would be to crawl through the slightly open window there, which we opened. So I crawled in, came round, and as I went to open the door, my hand was, and I kid you not, was literally on the door handle. The door opened from the outside, and Chris, my other friend, brought Colin in, who was very dazed. We asked him what had happened. And he said that basically he was minding his own business, but the next minute he was knocked to the ground. And as he was going down, he sort of looked up thinking he was going to be attacked, and there was nobody there. So we told Peter Paget about this the following day, before we left. And Peter Paget thought that it may well have been what was known as the invisible walker at Star House. Things did happen after that, but without sounding like Arthur Shuttlewood, you'll have to read the book to find out, which is hopefully going to be reprinted by John in the not too distant future. That was the first of a number of unexplained events that we had. We also had some classic UFO sightings. Now, the first took place in April of 1977, and we were walking at night down from the Copse, which is here, down this track to the White Gate area, which is approximately here. Now, it was a beautiful night. It was crystal clear, it was moonlit, there wasn't a sound to be heard. It was totally still, totally silent. The only sound we could hear were the trains going through Warminster station about a mile away. So that gives you an idea of how sound was travelling. Now, the next few pictures are, I'm afraid, digital recreations, because again, I'm afraid, nighttime Polaroid instamatic photography didn't exist in those days. That's an idea of what it looked like that night. If any of you have been up onto Cradle Hill, I will give you a rough idea of where you're actually looking at, because it is a little bit murky. Over this way is Cop Heap, and here is the start of Battlesbury Hill, which is an old Iron Age fort. Now, as I say, there was no wind, it was dead still. It was a beautiful evening. This will give you an idea, again, of the topography. I do wish that these things actually came with multiple LEDs, because I could actually recreate the sighting for you. From the West Wiltshire Golf Club, 4 red lights, equally distant spaced apart, came over this direction, over Elm Hill, over Cop Heap, and continued over to Battlesbury Hill. Totally silent, exactly in a straight line formation, and as I say, there was, as far as we were concerned, we ticked all the boxes already. We'd gone through our mental checklist, and it was a UFO sighting. That's a daylight look of how those 4 lights would have looked. They just pulsed. Then, the extreme left-hand object, this one here, which we'll call the leader for want of a better say, shot off horizontally, and I won't do it fast, at speed, and then did a flawless 90-degree turn without stopping and shot straight up into the sky, leaving the 3 other objects there. Again, they stayed in that position for about a minute or so, before then just majestically shooting straight up, again without making a sound. Some people have said to me, oh, it was experimental military technology because Cradle Hill and Warminster are so close to Salisbury Plain. Well, I don't know of any type of technology that we've got these days that can do a flawless 90-degree turn without stopping at speed and totally silently. Now, the second sighting we had was in July, August. I'm afraid my memory is a bit vague on that. July or August of 1977. We were again staying, it was our last stay at the Fountain Centre, Star House. And we were staying in what was known as the Green Room, which was at the very top of the house, there. And that gives you a rough idea of the view out of the window. That actual chimney cowl there is there. Right. It was mid-afternoon. Lovely summer's day. My friend Chris was lying on his bed, which looked directly out the window. I'm on a side bed with my nose in a book, which, as anybody will probably tell you, is what I do for 95% of the time. Chris jumped off his bed, I assumed he'd been asleep, and went to the window and said, "What the flaming hell's that?" but in a bit more colourful language. Traversing the sky, from right to left, says he, hoping to get the slides on. There we go. Was a silvery cigar-shaped object. Now, again, it's a recreation, and silver doesn't look very good on grey, so that's why it's blue, so I do apologise. I had just passed my O-level in photography, and was the proud owner of a single lens reflex camera with a 400mm telephoto lens. Chris had grabbed his binoculars and was looking at it, and I went to the window, and this object was moving this direction, quite slowly, as Arthur Shuttlewood said earlier on, a gentle giant of the sky. I then decided I'm going to try and take a photograph of this. Now, don't ask me why I did this next bit, because I still to this day don't know. I dashed downstairs, screwing on the telephoto lens as I went, and went out into the garden of Star House, where I knew there was a clothesline embedded in concrete. So I rested the camera up against it. Now, in those days, with single lens reflex cameras, there used to be a ground glass screen that you looked through. I focused correctly. I exposed correctly. I had this damn thing directly in the centre of the viewfinder. And I took 4 shots. The 4th one actually had the tips of elm tree on the left-hand side. Now, you may not want to believe this, I don't know, it's entirely up to you. When I got the photographs back, about a week later, after I got home, because again this was in the days before we used to have the old 24-hour film processing unit, I opened the pack and started going through the photographs. Colin and Chris at long leads, going through. And I've got to these 4 pictures. On the 3 of the pictures, there was light grey cloud, blue sky, and on the 4th, light grey cloud, blue sky, and the tips of the trees, but no object. Whatever that thing was, it didn't register. Now, again, you're probably thinking, you imagined it or whatever. Then how is it that Chris, while I was taking the 2nd and 3rd photographs, yelled down from the window, "It's got to be real, because there are people up on the hill by the golf club, and they're pointing at it." Now, there were no appendages from this thing, because Chris was looking at it through his binoculars. So again, what was it we saw? Again, to this day, I don't know. I wish I did. Now, I mentioned earlier on the ugly face of UFO politics. The Fountain Centre was winding down, and a new group had opened up in Warminster called UFO Info. It was run and staffed by complete volunteers. They did it in their spare time. The ethos was good. It lasted, as far as I'm aware, 6 issues, so it lasted just over a year. And then the mystery began to peter out. Now, before I go on, so what was the Warminster mystery? Was it media hype? Was it the time was just right for something to actually happen in Warminster? Was Warminster the place to be? When things kicked off in '65, it was the start of the hippie movement. And, you know, Warminster was a happening place. It's where people wanted to be. Was it Arthur Shuttlewood's overt, diligent reporting? I mean, if you were to go and read one of Arthur's books, and I believe there is actually one on the stalls in the merchant's room, his writing was very, very florid, to put it mildly. He exaggerated. There's no two ways about it. But I've seen things in Warminster, and as far as I am aware, something weird did happen there. Another couple of reasons, particularly in the 60s, was that there was something in the 1950s passed called the Clean Air Bill. Now, I don't know if anybody can remember that far back. I certainly can't. But in those days, smog was a problem in towns because of the amount of coal that was being burnt on domestic fires and obviously heavy industry. So the government basically forbade the burning of fossil fuels in towns. And slowly but surely, over the next few years, the air cleared. So a generation is starting to see the sky as they've never seen it before. It's also the start of the space age. So, you know, the Americans and the Russians are launching goodness knows what hardware up there. And it's also the dawn of mass air transportation. So again, night flights. Allied to this, that is one possible reason as to what the Warminster mystery was. But as I say, it touched a lot of people. A lot of today's UFO researchers cut their teeth in Warminster. I'm talking of people like Phil Mantle and Tim Good, Nick Redfern, people like that. They all visited the town, they saw things such as I did, and they were touched by it. I mean, for example, the left-hand picture there is an eye which was scratched onto the barn in Cradle Hill. That photograph actually dates from 1976. There are also 2 other photographs in my collection, one of, shall we say, the little green man, and one with some Tolkien-style writing on it. The second middle picture there really does speak for itself. That was actually scratched onto the gatepost of the white gate. And the third picture, ignore the Slim Jim in the corner there, beep, and is the ginger floss real? Does anybody know who the ginger floss is or might be? Peter Paget was ginger. And he came out with some really weird things. Underneath that, and sadly you can't see it, is something else scratched, which is a bit faded when that was taken. Peter Paget, go back to Venus, we don't want your lies anymore. So henceforth, the ginger floss, which is widely believed, was Peter Paget. Now, in 1996, Arthur Shuttlewood died, and basically with him, the Warminster mystery. Although it had been dying down from around 1980, when Arthur's health took a deteriorating turn, and he actually stopped actively sky watching. As I say, Warminster has been forgotten to a degree, or has it? Arthur's second book, his third book, his fourth book, his fifth book, and his sixth book. 1969, 1971, 1975, 1977, 1978. So he was still amassing material, even in that time. UFO UK by Peter Paget was actually his second book. The first book was The Welsh Triangle, which was a bestseller. And his agents wanted another book from him very quickly. So he purloined a lot of the articles from the Fountain Journal, our own experiences included, and of which I'm still a bit nipped with him because basically, although in the Fountain Journal he'd taken great trouble to keep our identities secret, there we were in black and white. Ken Rogers is the Warminster Triangle, which was mentioned earlier. Now, if you are skeptics, I recommend this book to you. In Alien Heat by Steve Dewey and the late John Rees. Steve Dewey is now my writing partner. We call ourselves yin and yang. Steve is an uber skeptic. I sit on the fence because of the experiences I had in Warminster. It is a very good book. It's very, very critical. And I must admit, this is where I have got some of my information from. Steve and I at the moment are working on what we hope to be the definitive book on Warminster, provisionally entitled, at least here at the moment, Warminster the Forgotten Mystery, in which we intend, fingers crossed, and my good friend John Hanson and Dawn Holloway here will know exactly the task that's in front of me here. We are going to try and chronicle the entire Warminster phenomenon from the year dot to the present day. And make no mistake, UFOs are still seen in Warminster, but not with the alarming frequency that they were before. And my own book, currently unavailable, but I'm working on it. Last 2 years, I was involved with a similar named event to the one here this weekend in Warminster, called Weird 9 and 10, very imaginative titles. And one of the theories that kept coming up time and time again was, is Warminster a portal area? Is it a window area? And somebody said to me, oh, it's a bit like that Stargate programme. You know, things pop in and out. Well, believe it or not, Warminster does have a Stargate. There it is. It's actually at Heaven's Gate on the Longleat Estate. It's actually a monument to the Millennium, which was constructed just before the Millennium. So, yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of people have great fun with that. Now, for the last 4 years, I have organised an annual Warminster Skywatch reunion. It's popular-ish. I think the record we've had of people on the hill is about 60. And there again, I say it, most of them are old hippies trying to relive their youth. In 2009, when the first weird event was on, the Skywatch was part of the event. And I admit I'm getting on. I can no longer do all-nighters. The blood's getting a bit thin and the bones protest slightly. So I left the hill at about 11:30. And there was, at 12 o'clock, or just gone 12 o'clock, a classic Warminster UFO sighting. One of the researchers that was there is a guy called Robert Moore, who is very diligent. And he actually saw this and has done a lot of research and cannot explain what it was he saw. It was basically a fast-moving light which changed from green, I believe, to white and then moved erratically over the Battersby Hill direction. As I said, I wasn't there. And that is, again, one of the famous myths of Warminster is that you'd turn up on the hill and people would say, "You've just missed a good one." It always happens when you're not there. So, open invitation to anybody if they're in the area. Please do come along, if you so wish. It's free. One of the few things in this world these days that is free. I do have to, unfortunately, get the okay from the army these days because they are very twitchy. They used to be in the old days. In fact, a little story I can tell you now. Colin and I decided in 1986 to go up for a 10th anniversary. And guess what? Weather was bad. So we hunkered down in the car. We must have nodded off at about 10 o'clock. Around 11 o'clock, I'm woken up by headlights coming towards us, and I'm thinking, oh, fellow sky watchers. It wasn't. It was the army. And we were forcibly ejected from the hill with the threat of arrest. And these guys carried what were then FN rifles. And I tell you, you don't argue with one of those. You don't argue. Right, I'm more or less done. So, I'm going to throw the floor open to anybody if they've got any questions. Yes, sir.
Kev, I wanted to ask you really, were you aware during the time that you were there about the level of hoaxing that went on with some of the kites that were launched? We obviously know who the persons are that did it.
No. Hoaxing, unfortunately, is human nature. And you did get it. I mean, the famous one is David Simpson's 1970 odd so-called UFO photograph, which
I
was...
saw that.
Yeah, I know you did, Lionel, yeah.
I saw it physically.
Yeah, and David Simpson will actually be at Cradle Hill this coming Skywatch. He always brings the kit with him, and he recreates it for us. And I mean, you know, it is, you can see how people were suckered in. But as I said, what I saw, it ticked all the boxes. And I can't rationally explain, to this day, those two main sightings that I have. Does that answer your question, sir?
Yes.
Yes.
We come from Warminster. Just tell me, I've never seen the barn up on the top of the hill, but could a tramp have been sleeping there and his heartbeat recorded? Was there room for him to be there and you had not known it?
The question was that the lady had never been to the barn at Cradle Hill, and is it possible that someone, a tramp, could have been sleeping up there? Well, no, in as such that when we went into the tunnels to record those test sounds, there was nobody in there. It is possible that there may have been a tramp up there at other times, but definitely not that time. Okay, the barn doors were shut. It is actually a grain drying barn. I forgot to point that out. I do apologise. Under this tunnel there were two 90-degree arms which went off, and when you crawled down and looked up, there were two circular holes in each arm, and they led up into the grain drying silos. And that is actually always padlocked. But in those days, the only thing that was uncovered, as far as we were aware, was actually that grain hole cover that we actually crawled down. Anybody else? Yes, Lionel.
Thinking about that, I think one or two people gave themselves a nasty shock by crawling into the drying tunnels and then sort of think, oh, we haven't got a light, so they got their petroliser out and there was a sort of minor explosion of the methane.
Yes, and as I said earlier on as well, I don't know if you were in the building at the here at the time, there was a lot of consumption of illegal substances down there as well. But no, definitely that is a very true story, that there were people in there that, you know, no lights, lighter on, woof.
So I was just wondering about Mr. Shuttleworth, was it?
Arthur Shuttlewood, yeah.
Yeah, rather begs the question, hit on the head by a tank lid, might his experience not have been an epileptic seizure or some kind, you know, lights and...
It's possible. I mean, the reason why I brought that little bit of Arthur's story up is that I always find it very interesting that someone who was held in such high regard by ufologists went UFO spotting and he only got one eye that worked properly. I mean, there is no evidence to say that Arthur Shuttlewood actually did suffer from epilepsy. But one thing which we have found out is that Arthur, because of his injury, could not drive. So everywhere he went, he was either driven or he used public transport.
And the other thing, I mean, the presence of the military, I mean, is this not the territory of the, remember the flap out the manta ray, or whatever it was in, I think it was in northern England, it turned out to be the testing of the stealth bomber. Are we not talking testing of the classified military stuff?
You will do, simply because Warminster, as I said earlier on, is situated right next to Salisbury Plain. Boscombe Down, one of the top secret military plane testing area bases, is nearby. But, yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I would say that a good number of UFO sightings in Warminster probably were misidentifications of military aircraft of some description. But there is still a hardcore number of sightings which cannot rationally be explained away.
And can I also concur with you?
I'll get the microphone first.
Can I also concur with you, Kevin, and say that, I mean, we've been researching for a number of years, and what you've described earlier that you saw, I mean, these things go back to the 1920s and the 1930s, and probably even farther back than that. And a lot of them are multi-witness sightings, and clearly, you know, this is long before this sort of technology was developed. And it's just a point I wanted to make, really.
Yeah, you're right. In fact, actually, there is, and I think I can get the dates right here. I think it was around 1908, a Phantom aircraft was seen flying over the area at speed, brilliantly illuminated. And this was only a few scant years after the Wright brothers first flew at Kitty Hawk. There are even reports going back to the 17th and 18th centuries of similar type of things being seen. One of them was, I can't remember the name, but it was a Reverend somebody or other. But he actually reported that people had seen what appeared to be balls in the sky battling each other. And as I say, this, you know, this was sort of in 1800s. So, you know, it's like most things with the UFO phenomenon, it goes back years anyway. So, you know, Warminster did not kick off in 1964.
Would you like an insight on, further insight on Arthur Shuttlewood? Or have you done enough of that already?
I think I might have done enough of that already. I mean, like you, I met Arthur on a number of occasions. I found him a charming man.
Yes, I agree with that.
Probably slightly misguided, and he was quite sometimes gullible. There is I'll briefly touch on this before I finish. There was a very famous, or a very infamous story that two people went to Heaven's Gate and they saw a UFO land which was the size of a soup plate. And then magically this UFO came back to full size. The man went in, it went back down to its old size again, flew off, must have done 2 or 3 orbits around the moon, came back and disgorged the occupant. That story was given to Arthur Shuttlewood by Bob Strong, who I mentioned earlier on. Bob Strong and the other member of Arthur Shuttlewood's initial skywatching team, Sybil Champion. And they did it to see what Arthur would do with it. And before they could retract the story, it was printed. So then it was too late. And make no mistake, the good people of Warminster over the years have made not a tidy sum out of the phenomenon, but by God, it's been a bloody good tourist industry for them. So I think that's it, John.
I think we've got time for... Are there any more questions? Anybody
Well, I'll just give you an anecdote on Bob Strong, because apparently, because I was a bit of a cynical old fart from before, or in those days perhaps a cynical young fart, I was told that before Bob Strong had his arm wrenched off by a lion or something like that, that he seriously wanted to punch me on the nose. I don't know what that proves.
I think it proves that you found him out, Lionel.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Greg. I just want to say thank you to Greg for running around all weekend with me and fetching and carrying things. It's been wonderful. I had a phone call about 6 months ago from this bloke called Kevin Goodman. And he phoned up to ask me something that should have taken about a minute and a half. Well, we ended up chatting for about 40 minutes.
It was something like that.
And I have to admit, I hadn't heard of it. And John Hanson came down the next weekend and I said, John, have you heard of a bloke called Kevin Goodman? And then John waxed lyrical for about an hour and a half and kept on talking about it all weekend.
I love you.
And I thought, I've got to check this Goodman fellow out. And so I looked at some stuff to do with it. And I saw about what people had said about you online and stuff. And I thought, I have been running this conference now for 12 years. Why the hell haven't we had you speaking here? It's been a real pleasure, Kevin. Thank you very much for coming. I hope you'll come back again because it's been fantastic having you here. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Kevin Goodman.
Thank you very much.